Do you like cheating out big and powerful creatures from your hand and graveyard? Do you like it even better when you can make multiple copies of those creatures turn after turn? Have you wanted to play a commander with an ability unique to almost anything else? Then I think it's time we play with time with Obeka Brute Chronologist. So let's start by looking at Obeka and what she can do. Obeka is a 4-mana creature with an ability that says tap, the player whose turn it is may end the turn. A simple but very unique ability, Obeka provides us with a broad starting point in that we want to run cards with powerful effects that are normally balanced by having a downside that typically happens at the end step, something Obeka helps us now avoid. We can also run Obeka with cards that have negative ETB effects, and by activating her ability to end the turn, we don't have to suffer those effects. But after researching all the cards that I think worked well with Obeka, I came to a few conclusions. The first is that she works well with a lot of cards that make token copies of creatures on the battlefield, often with haste, that normally get exiled at the end step. The second is that she also works well with cards that reanimate or make token copies of creatures in the graveyard, often giving them haste too. Lastly, she allows us to play multiple extra turn spells that only cost 2 to 3 mana, where normally on the extra turn you would lose the game at the end step. Now, after looking at a lot of Obeka lists, I noticed that a lot of them lean hard typically into one of these directions. But because I like to have my cake and eat it too, I wondered if we could actually find a way of incorporating all these strategies and playing them together. Well, as it turns out, if you provide the right support cards, a lot of these strategies actually work fairly synergistically together. So here's our game plan. Firstly, the creatures we plan to clone need to be impactful if we're going to spend time and effort reanimating them, and we also need to make sure they're non-legendary so we don't get hit by the legend rule. Therefore, big and impactful non-legendary creatures are the bread and butter of our deck, with an emphasis on creatures with ETBs or combat triggers to fully take advantage of the haste that many of these cards provide. Secondly, we need a way to get those creatures into our yard when we have our reanimator effects in hand. So to help with this, most of our card advantage will actually be looting or draw discard effects. Finally, we round it out with our extra turn spells and a good amount of mana acceleration at 2 mana, because a lot of our cards that let us have explosive turns actually require Obeka to be out, so we want to get her out on turn 3 as consistently as possible. Together, this should result in us cheating out big creatures, making multiple token copies of those creatures, and then overwhelming our opponents in value, especially when we can support that with hasty creatures and cheap extra turn spells. In addition, we also have the fun side benefit that should our opponents interact on our turn, we can end the turn, essentially nullifying their spells from the stack. But now we know our overall game plan and how we plan to win, let's begin by looking at our mana accelerants that are going to help to get that game plan online as quickly as possible. Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, Izzet Signet, Rakdos Signet, Felwar Stone, Talisman of Creativity, Talisman of Dominance, Talisman of Indulgence, and Ornithopter of Paradise are all 2-mana ramp pieces that let us curve nicely into a turn 3 Obeka. Professional Facebreaker is a 3-mana creature that provides mana acceleration in the form of treasures for each opponent we connect with, while in rarer cases it can also provide card advantage should we need it. Facebreaker also makes a good clone target, and multiple copies of these on board will let us really start to hoard some treasure. Cursed Mirror is a 3-mana rock that taps for red, but when it ETBs becomes a copy of any creature on the battlefield. Normally mana rocks become less useful as the game goes on, but Cursed Mirror actually becomes more powerful as we can copy one of our big creatures for extra value. We can also copy an opponent's creature, and if we manage to get a powerful non-legendary, we can even make multiple copies of it and have fun with creatures we normally wouldn't have access to. Fate Stitcher is a 4-mana creature that we can tap to tap or untap a target permanent. Normally too expensive for the effect, but with Obeka and all the loot effects we run, often we can cast this for just 1 mana and have it use its ability right away. In addition, some of our clone and reanimator effects actually rely on tap abilities, so Fate Stitcher allows us to get those effects again. Dockside Extortionist is a 2-mana creature that is one of our most powerful mana generators in the deck. This card is a house in any deck that runs it, but with our clone effects we can ensure we trigger Dockside's ETB turn after turn, making our mana requirements a non-issue. Our last mana accelerant is our most powerful, Ancient Copper Dragon. This 6-mana creature lets us roll a d20 and make that many treasures when it deals combat damage to an opponent. Even low rolls with this creature is still ample mana, and the fact we plan to copy it and often have itself or the copies have haste means just 1 turn with this out can often be game changing. And that covers our mana accelerants. Now let's move on to our card advantage package and the ways we plan on filling up our graveyard and then eventually our hand. Careful Study, Invasion of Mercadia, Charter Course, Thrill of Possibility, and Tormenting Voice are all cheap loot effects to help set up our hand and graveyard. Faithless Looting and Dahada's Ploy are also loot effects, except they have the benefit of also being able to be recast from the graveyard, which not only provides extra looting, but also makes great loot fodder itself. Frantic Search is a 3-mana instant that lets us draw 2, discard 2, then untap up to 3 lands. A great loot effect that essentially allows us to do it for free. It also has additional synergy with the few lands we run that tap for more than 1 mana. Ideas Unbound is a 2-mana sorcery that lets us dig deep by drawing 3 and then having to discard 3 at end of turn. With Obeka out, however, we can choose to skip the discard part at end of turn, making this a 2-mana draw 3, a great return on investment. Ledger Shredder is a 2-mana creature that lets us loot anytime any player casts their second spell each turn. So, this not only loots nicely as a passive effect, but if we want to, we can also clone it, helping fill the yard faster. Fairy Mastermind is a 2-mana creature with flash that lets us draw a card whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, with an activated ability to draw each player a card for 4 mana. Although this won't provide consistent card draw early, it should draw a respectable amount of cards in the mid to late game, and it being clonable is why it made the cut. Ghostly Pilferer is a 2-mana creature that draws us a card whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, like their commanders for example, and also if we pay 2 mana anytime it becomes untapped. In addition, we can also discard a card as many times as we want to give Pilferer unblockable until end of turn. This card does everything we want it to do at such a low cost. It draws us cards in a variety of ways which can be useful depending on how the game plays out, and it also lets us discard the right cards for our reanimation effects. Consecrated Sphinx is a 6-mana creature that draws us 2 cards every time an opponent draws a card. Just one Sphinx out quickly fills our hand with cards, but by the time we clone it even once, we should be able to close out the game quickly from there, especially if we draw one of our extra turn spells. Infernal Sovereign is another 6-mana creature that makes us skip our draw step, but then lets us draw a card and lose a life every time we play a land or cast a spell. Although this creature seems best suited to a Storm or Low to the Ground type strategy, this will still draw a decent amount of cards on its own. But by now you know our plan isn't to have just one on board, and while it can get dangerous paying all that life for cards, by the time we have 2 to 3 we should be able to reach the finish line before the life loss really matters. Our last card advantage piece can draw us the biggest amount of cards in one turn, and that is Ancient Silver Dragon, an 8-mana creature that lets us roll a d20 and draw cards equal to the result. Similar to Ancient Copper Dragon, even quote-unquote bad rolls still end up being highly effective at fueling our hand, and the fact it grants no maximum hand size makes the high rolls even better. Just be careful when cloning this one, as you may end up decking yourself if you aren't careful. And that's all of our card advantage pieces. Now let's look at the cards that are going to help us interact with our opponents while still taking advantage of Obeka's ability. Douthie Voidwalker is a 2-mana creature that acts as a hate piece against opponents' graveyards and aristocrat strategies, while also acting as a steal effect by allowing us to cast any spell that gets exiled under it for free. A very powerful card for the mana cost. Often the hardest part about playing it is deciding whether to keep it around for the hate effect or cast in a powerful spell for free. In our deck, however, being able to potentially clone it every turn means we can have the best of both worlds. Playing your opponent's card is always a fun effect to have access to, and this lets us do it turn after turn. Speaking of steal effects, Agent of Treachery is a 7-mana creature that lets us steal any permanent when it ETBs. Not only this, but if we control 3 or more permanents we don't own, then Agent draws us 3 cards on our end step. Although stealing just 1 permanent isn't groundbreaking, the fact we can clone Agent and get a huge payoff after making the 3rd copy makes it interaction worth running. Amphan Mutineer is a 4-mana creature that exiles a non-salamander creature and replaces it with a 4/3 salamander when it ETBs. It also has Encore for 6 mana. Exile effects are always a preferable way to interact with creatures, and being attached to a clonable body that makes this effect repeatable is very welcome. But the fact we can also get this effect from our graveyard synergizes very nicely with our looting cards and makes it nice discard fodder in the early game if we don't feel we need this effect in hand. Balefire Dragon is a 7-mana creature that when it deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. If this connects, it almost certainly wipes most, if not all of an opponent's creatures on the battlefield, and when we start cloning it, our opponents will have a hard time keeping anything on board. Inferno Titan is a 6-mana creature that deals 3 damage divided as we choose when it ETBs or attacks. As Wizard prints more and more powerful creatures, especially those with low mana values, they typically have lower stat lines to partly make up for this. So what this means for Inferno Titan is that its 3 damage ability is actually becoming stronger over time, especially against higher tier casual decks. Because Inferno Titan also provides this trigger on ETB and attack, it works very well with all our clone and reanimation effects that provide haste, making this trigger all the more effective. Terror of the Peaks is a 5-mana creature that says, spells your opponents cast that target Terror of the Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast, and whenever another creature ETBs under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So on its own, it lets any creature we have ETB act as a form of interaction to remove problematic creatures, planeswalkers, battles, and even players if their life totals are low enough. But when we start cloning it, the amount of damage dealt quickly becomes a win condition in its own right, even against players with healthy life totals. Our last interactive card is Archon of Cruelty, an 8-mana creature that says, when it ETBs or attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card, and loses 3 life. You draw a card and gain 3 life. So not only does Archon attack an opponent's life total, hand, and creature board state, but it also buffs our life total and fills our hand. This creature really ticks a lot of boxes, and once we have a few copies on board, that becomes a lot of advantage that is difficult for your opponents to overcome. And that's all our interactive pieces. Now we've discussed cloning quite a bit already, so let's move on to the cards that are going to help clone our creatures on the battlefield. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is a 3-mana enchantment saga that on the first chapter makes a goblin token who creates treasure, on the second chapter it loots, and on the third chapter it becomes a reflection of Kiki-Jiki, a creature we can pay 1 mana into to make a copy of a non-legendary creature we control with haste that we are meant to exile at the next end step. With Obeka, however, we get around this by ending the turn when that trigger goes on the stack, meaning we get to keep every creature we copy. It's also notable the reflection isn't legendary itself, so we can also copy this with one of our other clone effects. Flame Shadow Conjuring is a 4-mana enchantment that lets us pay 1 red mana anytime a non-token creature of ours ETBs, and we can make a token copy of it with haste that gets exiled at the end step. Although this trigger isn't repeatable like some of our other clone effects, which is definitely a downside, it does provide some resilience in not being a creature, which protects it from creature removal and board wipes, the most common type of removal. Jax's the Troublemaker is a 4-mana creature that we often won't cast for this mana cost because we can blitz it in for only 2 mana, which not only grants it haste, but also the ability that when it dies, we get to draw a card. We can also pay a red, tap, and discard a card to make a token copy of another creature and essentially give it blitz as well. So Jax's helps with our game plan on a number of levels. She provides a cloning effect, gives that clone the ability to draw a card when it dies, fills our graveyard with the cards we want there for our reanimation effects, and with Obeka out, we can get her doing all of these things for cheap. For these reasons, she is one of the best, if not the best, clone effects we have in the deck. Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker is a 5-mana creature with haste that we can tap right away to make a token copy of a non-legendary creature we control that also gains haste. Perhaps the most straightforward but nonetheless still powerful clone effect we run, it does exactly what we want it to, making token copies of our powerful creatures turn after turn. Mirage Phalanx is a 6-mana creature with Soulbond that says, as long as Mirage Phalanx is paired with another creature, each of those creatures has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of this creature, except it has haste and loses Soulbond. Exile it at end of combat. So this card not only makes a clone of our powerful creatures, but it also makes a copy of itself as well, albeit without Soulbond, but still a sturdy body in a 4/4. The Soulbond does limit the extent of what we can clone, therefore making it less flexible than some of our other options, but it's also non-legendary itself, meaning just like Reflections of Kiki-Jiki, we can copy it as well, really speeding up the clock with which we can make our clone army. Ortheon, Hero of Lava Brink, is a 4-mana creature that we can pay 2 mana and tap to make a token copy of a creature with haste, but if we pay 9 mana and tap it, we can make 5 copies of a creature instead. I'm sure I don't have to explain how quickly the game will swing in our favour if we can make 5 copies of an Archon of Cruelty, Terror of the Peaks, or Ancient Copper Dragon. Ortheon is a clone effect we will often activate for its first ability, but will heavily strive to reach its second. Rionya Fire Dancer is a 5-mana creature that makes 1 + X copies of a creature we control, where X is the number of instants and sorceries we have cast this turn. As of recording, this list has about 15 instants and sorceries, which means when Rionya is on the battlefield, we should be able to get 2 copies of a creature consistently. But even when it is only 1 copy, we get this effect the turn she hits the battlefield, still making her worthy of including. Our last clone effect is Twin Flame, a 2-mana sorcery that has Strive for 3 mana and says, choose any number of target creatures you control. For each of them, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it has haste. Exile those tokens at the beginning of the next end step. A cheap way to clone our creatures in the early game, especially if we have just cheated a bomb into play with one of our reanimation effects, but in the late game we can also use it to clone multiple creatures at once, potentially helping us close out the game quicker. And that covers our clone effects. Now that we know how we're cloning all our big creatures, let's see how we're taking advantage of all of our loot effects by looking at our reanimation package. Reanimate is a 1-mana sorcery that lets us reanimate any creature from any graveyard after we lose life equal to its mana value. Not much needs to be said here, this is simply a card you can't leave home without if reanimation is the name of the game. Persist is a 2-mana sorcery that reanimates a non-legendary creature from our yard with a -1/-1 counter on it. Although this won't hit all of our creatures, the majority of our creatures are non-legends, as are the bombs we want to reanimate. This is also very cheap for the effect, working great with our looting cards to potentially get a bomb out early. Animate Dead is a 2-mana enchantment that can return a creature from anyone's graveyard to the battlefield and gives it -1/-0 while it enchants it. Like Reanimate, this is one of the best options we have when playing Reanimator, and it earns a place in our list until a similar on-theme option becomes available to us. Apprentice Necromancer is a 2-mana creature we can pay 1 black into, tap and sacrifice to return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield with haste. While other reanimation effects exist that are cheaper and don't require tapping to activate, Apprentice is a non-legend, meaning we can clone this to set up some pretty explosive turns depending on what we've looted or had put into our yard. Arami of the Deadtide is a 3-mana creature we can tap and exile cards equal to the number of opponents we have to give a creature in our graveyard encore. Although we aren't cheating cost like our other reanimation options, Arami does give us the potential to make up to 3 token copies of a creature when we use her. If we target the right creature, this could be backbreaking for our opponents. Chainer Nightmare Adept is a 4-mana creature that we can discard a card to once per turn to cast any creature from our graveyard. In addition, any non-token creatures of ours that ETB and didn't come from our hand gain haste until end of turn. So Chainer fulfills a number of roles. Firstly, he is a discard outlet for our reanimation effects. Secondly, he gives us access to the creatures in our graveyard, effectively making our graveyard our second hand. And finally, he provides haste to those reanimated creatures as well as Obeka herself, because we typically cast her from the command zone, meaning we can use their abilities right away. Felden of the Third Path is a 3-mana creature we can pay 3 mana into and tap to make an artifact token copy of any creature in our graveyard that gains haste until end of turn. Although his activation cost isn't cheap compared to some of our other options, being cheap to get down as well as repeatable is more than enough justification to include him. Ayara, Widow of the Realm, is a 3-mana creature whose front side isn't really relevant to us unless we can use it to close out a game. But if we pay 5 mana and a Phyrexian red to transform her, she becomes Ayara Furnace Queen, who can return an artifact or creature to the battlefield with haste. Ayara isn't cheap to get going, but if we have the mana, we can get her effect right away and she costs nothing thereafter to keep getting her powerful effect. Our last reanimation effect is Dawn of the Dead, a 5-mana enchantment which reanimates a creature from our graveyard with haste at the cost of 1 life each upkeep. Similar to Ayara, the effect is costly, but because we get it each turn for the small cost of life and the creature gets haste, it should still do some work, especially in longer, grindier games. And that's all of our reanimation effects. Now let's look at our utility package and all of the cards that help to enhance our game plan. Alchemist's Gambit, Final Fortune, Last Chance and Warrior's Oath are all 2 to 3 mana spells that give us an extra turn at the cost of losing the game at the next turn's end step. With Obeka, however, we don't intend on paying that cost, so being able to take extra turns for such a small cost is a very powerful effect to have access to. Combine that with the fact many of our clone and reanimation effects provide haste to our creatures should ensure those extra turns aren't wasted. Underworld Breach is a 2-mana enchantment that gives all the non-land cards in our graveyard escape 3. All the looting we plan to do, in addition to the removal we will no doubt encounter, should ensure this card pulls its weight as a powerful recursion tool. Anger is a 4-mana creature that grants our creatures haste if it's in our graveyard and we control a mountain. The perfect discard fodder for our loot effects, it also makes any creatures we play that much more threatening, especially ones we can reanimate early. Ardent Elementalist is a 4-mana creature that lets us return an instant or sorcery to our hand when it ETBs. A great value piece to recur powerful cards like Reanimate and Twin Flame, perhaps more valuable though is its ability to recur most of our extra turn spells. Combine this with a repeatable clone effect, and you can take extra turns based on the number of cards you have left in your deck, which will be enough for most opponents to concede the game then and there. Our last utility card is Sneak Attack, a 4-mana enchantment that we can pay 1 red mana into to put a creature from our hand onto the battlefield with haste. With the right creatures in hand and Obeka on the field, this can quickly have your opponents on the back foot dealing with multiple hasty bombs all at once. And that's all of our utility cards. Now let's finish up by looking at any of the notable lands the deck runs. We only have 2 lands to talk about here, and the first is Manamo, School at Water's Edge, a land that we can pay 1 blue into and tap to untap a legendary permanent. Using this with cards like Jaxus, Kiki Jiki or Felden will allow us to double up on our clone effects, putting our clone plan into overdrive. The last is Lotus Field, a land that ETBs tapped and taps for 3 mana of any one colour, but requires us to sacrifice 2 lands when it ETBs. With Obeka out, however, we can end the turn when the sack trigger goes on the stack, essentially ramping us 2 mana on a land that protects itself with hexproof. And that's the deck. Obeka is one of the most unique commanders in the effect that she offers, and being able to take advantage of negative end step and ETB triggers opens up interesting lines and cards to play. There is something just really enjoyable about breaking the rules and then benefiting from it, especially when that benefit involves cheating big creatures into play and making multiple token copies of them. Just the idea of multiple token copies of an Archon of Cruelty, Consecrated Sphinx, or Ancient Copper Dragon just sounds really exciting, and I hope it does for you too. Well, that's it for today's deck tech. If you want to see this deck in action, make sure to stop by the channel because we will have gameplay videos up so you can see what to expect, as well as if this deck is right for you. Until next time, guys.